they said it couldn't be done. An army of 70,000 men, backed by war elephants, the ancient world's equivalent of tanks, marching against a force half its size, composed largely of mounted archers who had never seen such beasts before. The outcome seemed inevitable. Rome's legions had conquered the known world. Their discipline was legendary. Their tactics, unmatched. But on a frozen morning in what is now southern Italy, everything changed. The battle that followed would shatter assumptions about warfare that had stood for centuries, introduce Europe to a weapon it had never faced, and prove that sometimes, the army that shouldn't win does, and when it does, the world takes notice. This is the story of the Battle of Heraclea, fought in 280 BCE, where Pyrrhus of Epirus brought elephants to a land that had never seen them, and where Roman infantry met an Eastern style of warfare they were utterly unprepared for. But this isn't just about one battle. It's about the moment when two military philosophies collided, when the rigid formations of the West encountered the fluid mobility of the East, and when warfare itself began to transform. Because what happened on that battlefield would echo through military history for the next 2,000 years, from Alexander's campaigns to Napoleon's cavalry charges, from the Mongol invasions to modern combined arms doctrine. To understand why this battle mattered, we need to go back further. We need to understand what war looked like before this moment, and why the clash between elephants and horse archers represented something revolutionary. Picture the Mediterranean world in 280 BCE. It's a landscape of emerging powers, each convinced of their own superiority, each developing their own answer to the fundamental question of warfare: how do you win? In the West, Rome has an answer. It's written in blood across the Italian peninsula. The Roman legion, a formation of heavy infantry, shields locked, moving as one disciplined mass, has proven nearly unstoppable in the close, hilly terrain of Italy. Roman soldiers fight in tight ranks, their large shields forming a mobile wall, their short swords designed for stabbing in close quarters. They advance slowly, methodically, grinding down opposition through sheer discipline and staying power. It's warfare as engineering, warfare as mathematics. Hold the line. Absorb the charge. Break the enemy's will through attrition. For 2 centuries, this approach has worked beautifully. The Samnites, fierce mountain warriors who knew every valley and ridge of the Apennines, fell before the legions. The Etruscans, with their ancient civilization and wealthy cities, couldn't stand against Roman organization. One by one, the peoples of Italy learned the same lesson: you cannot break the Roman line. But Rome's success has bred a dangerous assumption. Roman commanders have come to believe that their way of war is the only way of war that matters. They've fought the same kind of battles, against the same kind of enemies, for so long that they've forgotten a crucial truth: the world is bigger than Italy, and other civilizations have been thinking about warfare just as hard, just as long, and have come to very different conclusions. In the East, a different philosophy has emerged. From the steppes of Central Asia to the courts of Persia, from the campaigns of Alexander to the successor kingdoms that carved up his empire, Eastern commanders have learned the value of mobility. Why stand and absorb punishment when you can move faster than your enemy can react? Why engage in the grinding, costly push of shield against shield when you can strike from a distance, retreat before the counterattack, and strike again from a different angle? The horse archer embodies this philosophy perfectly. Imagine a warrior who can loose an arrow while moving at full gallop, who can feint, retreat, wheel around and attack again before a foot soldier can even reach striking distance. The horse archer doesn't need to break the enemy's line. He just needs to bleed it, exhaust it, frustrate it until the moment comes, and the moment always comes, when discipline falters, when the formation breaks, when the pursuit begins and the real slaughter starts. For centuries, these two philosophies have operated in separate spheres. The Romans have built their reputation fighting the infantry-focused conflicts of Italy. The Eastern kingdoms have perfected their mobile tactics against each other, in the wide plains where cavalry can maneuver freely. But now, for the first time, they are about to meet. And caught between them is a man who understands both worlds, who has studied both ways of war, and who is about to teach Rome a lesson it will never forget. His name is Pyrrhus, and is marching into Italy with an army that represents the cutting edge of Hellenistic warfare. The king who knew too much. Pyrrhus of Epirus was born into a world of endless war. His childhood reads like something out of mythology, exiled as an infant when his father's kingdom fell, raised in foreign courts, restored to his throne through the intervention of Ptolemy I of Egypt, one of Alexander the Great's former generals. By the time he reached manhood, Pyrrhus had learned the most important lesson the Hellenistic world had to teach. In the age after Alexander, kingdoms rose and fell with shocking speed, and only the most skilled, most ruthless, most innovative commanders survived. But Pyrrhus wasn't just another ambitious king. He was a student of warfare in a way few rulers of his age could match. He had studied under some of Alexander's veterans. He had read the tactical treatises. He had fought in the endless succession wars that consumed the Greek world after Alexander's death. And more importantly, he had learned from his mistakes. In a battle against Demetrius Poliorcetes, another of the great commanders of the age, Pyrrhus had been outmaneuvered and defeated. It was a humiliation that would have broken a lesser man. Instead, Pyrrhus studied what had gone wrong, rebuilt his army, and when the rematch came, he won decisively. The ancient historian Plutarch tells us that Pyrrhus was considered the finest tactical commander of his age, second only to Alexander himself. Hannibal, centuries later, would rank him as one of the 3 greatest generals who ever lived. This wasn't empty praise. Pyrrhus had something rare among ancient commanders: he could adapt. He could analyze an enemy's strengths and weaknesses, then reorganize his entire army to exploit them. By 280 BCE, Pyrrhus ruled Epirus, a kingdom in what is now northwestern Greece and southern Albania. It wasn't a large kingdom, and it wasn't particularly rich, but Pyrrhus had built it into a formidable military power. His army was a microcosm of Hellenistic warfare at its peak: pike-wielding phalanxes in the Macedonian style, heavy cavalry for decisive charges, light infantry trained in skirmishing, and, here's what matters, contingents of horse archers and war elephants, borrowed from the Eastern kingdoms and integrated into a combined arms approach that could shift between different tactical modes as the situation demanded. Think about what this means. While Rome had perfected one way of fighting, Pyrrhus commanded an army that could fight in multiple ways. He could engage in a straight infantry push if that's what the terrain demanded. He could use his cavalry to turn a flank. He could harass with mobile skirmishers. He could deploy his elephants as breakthrough weapons. Most importantly, he could combine these elements in ways that would overwhelm an enemy who only knew how to fight one kind of battle. And then came the call from Italy. The Greek city of Tarentum, located in the heel of the Italian peninsula, was in trouble. Rome's expansion southward had put increasing pressure on the wealthy Greek colonies that dotted Italy's coastline. Tarentum had maintained its independence through a combination of diplomacy and defensive walls, but by 280 BCE, it was clear that Rome would eventually come for them. The Tarentines needed help, and they needed it from someone who could stand up to the Roman military machine. They called for Pyrrhus. For Pyrrhus, the invitation was irresistible. Here was a chance to build an empire in the West, to succeed where even Alexander had never gone. The wealth of Italy, the prestige of defeating Rome, the possibility of crossing to Sicily and then Africa, retracing Agamemnon's campaigns, becoming a second Alexander, it all seemed within reach. His advisors warned him. The Romans were formidable. Italy was far from home. But Pyrrhus had made his decision. He would bring his army to Italy, and he would show these Western warriors what Hellenistic warfare could do. In the spring of 280 BCE, Pyrrhus crossed the Adriatic with 25,000 infantry, 3,000 cavalry, and 20 war elephants. The Romans, confident in their military superiority, mobilized to meet him. They had numerical superiority. Some ancient sources suggest the Roman army outnumbered Pyrrhus by as much as 2-1. They had the advantage of fighting on familiar ground. They had an unbroken string of victories behind them. What they didn't have was experience fighting the kind of war Pyrrhus was about to bring to them. The beast they had never seen. Let's talk about the war elephant, because if you're going to understand what happened at Heraclea, you need to understand what these animals represented in ancient warfare. Imagine you're a Roman legionary. You've trained for years to hold your position in formation, to keep your shield up, to trust the man beside you. You've fought Samnites in the mountains, Gauls in the north. You know what combat feels like: the crash of shield on shield, the press of bodies, the exhaustion of holding the line. You're confident because you've done this before. You know what to expect. And then you see it. It's 8 feet tall at the shoulder, weighs 4 tons, and it's moving toward you faster than something that large has any right to move. It has a howdah strapped to its back carrying 3 or 4 soldiers armed with javelins and bows. Its tusks have been sharpened and sometimes capped with bronze. Its trunk can lift a man and throw him like a child's toy. And it's been trained for one purpose: to break your formation. This is your first time seeing an elephant. The animal doesn't exist in Italy. You have no frame of reference for something this massive that can also move with purpose, that can be directed by a handler, that can be used as a weapon. And neither does your horse. The Roman cavalry, already nervous about engaging Pyrrhus's horsemen, takes one look at these creatures and begins to panic. Horses that have never encountered elephants react with instinctive terror. They rear, they bolt, they refuse to advance. The Roman cavalry, a crucial component of their battle plan, begins to fall apart before the battle has truly begun. But the psychological impact goes deeper than simple fear. The war elephant represented a level of military sophistication that Rome hadn't encountered before. Training an elephant for warfare took years. It required specialized handlers, mahouts, who came from cultures with centuries of experience in elephant warfare. It required supply chains that could feed these enormous animals. It required tactical doctrines for how to employ them effectively. The presence of elephants signaled that Pyrrhus's army wasn't just larger or better equipped than what the Romans were used to. It represented an entirely different understanding of what warfare could be. The ancient sources tell us that Pyrrhus deployed his elephants carefully at Heraclea. He didn't just send them charging forward in a mindless assault. Instead, he used them as part of a combined arms approach. The elephants would advance, supported by light infantry who protected them from the sides and rear. When they hit the Roman line, they would create gaps, moments of chaos and confusion. And into those gaps would pour the cavalry and the phalanx, exploiting the breakthrough before the Romans could reorganize. This is sophisticated combined arms warfare, the kind of tactical thinking that takes generations to develop. And the Romans, for all their discipline and courage, had never faced anything like it. The Dance of Death. The Battle of Heraclea began in the way many ancient battles did, with both armies deploying in traditional formations, each commander believing they understood what was about to happen. The Roman consuls, there were 2 of them, as was Roman practice, positioned their legions in the standard checkerboard formation. First line, second line, third line. Each line composed of maniples, small units that could act independently but also combine into a solid wall when needed. On the wings, the Roman and Italian allied cavalry. Behind them, reserves. It was a deployment that had won 100 battles. Pyrrhus deployed differently. In the center, his phalanx, pike-wielding infantry organized in the Macedonian style, deeper and more rigid than the Roman formation but also more formidable in a straight push. On his wings, cavalry, both heavy lancers and the lighter, more mobile horse archers. And held in reserve, protected by light infantry and positioned where they could be deployed at the crucial moment, the elephants. The battle opened with skirmishing, as battles often did. Light troops from both sides, armed with javelins and slings, moved forward to harry the enemy's main line. This was standard practice, a way to test the opponent's discipline and possibly provoke a premature advance. The Roman hastati, the youngest and most aggressive troops, pushed forward to engage Pyrrhus's skirmishers. And then the real fighting began. The Roman infantry surged forward, shields locked, moving with the mechanical precision that had become their trademark. They hit Pyrrhus's phalanx with tremendous force. The Greek pike formation, for all its reputation, began to give ground. The pikes, 15 to 18 feet long, were devastating weapons when the phalanx maintained formation, but in close combat, against the Roman short sword, they became unwieldy. The Romans pushed into the gaps, getting inside the reach of the pikes, and suddenly Pyrrhus's center was in real trouble. For a moment, it looked like the battle would follow the pattern Rome expected. Superior numbers and Roman discipline would grind down the enemy's center, the flanks would hold, and by day's end, Pyrrhus would be dead or fleeing. The Roman officers began to sense victory. But Pyrrhus hadn't committed his full force yet. As the Roman infantry pushed deeper into his center, Pyrrhus unleashed his cavalry. Not in a simple flanking charge, that would have been too predictable, and the Roman cavalry was positioned to counter exactly that move. Instead, Pyrrhus's horse archers began a different kind of warfare, one the Romans had never experienced. They didn't charge the Roman line. They circled it. Imagine the frustration. You're a Roman legionary, focused on the enemy in front of you, maintaining your position in formation. And suddenly, arrows are coming from your right. You turn to face the threat, but the horsemen are already moving, wheeling away, and now arrows are coming from behind. You can't charge them, they're too fast. You can't ignore them, the arrows are finding gaps in your armor. Your formation, built for frontal combat, isn't designed for this kind of harassment. This is the essential difference between Roman and Eastern warfare distilled into a single tactical moment. The Romans were built to win a decisive engagement, to close with the enemy and break them through shock and discipline. The horse archers were built to avoid decisive engagement, to bleed the enemy from a distance, to create chaos and frustration until the moment came for the killing blow. And that moment was coming. As the Roman formation began to lose cohesion, distracted by the horse archers struggling against the phalanx in front of them, Pyrrhus sent in the elephants. The ancient sources describe the chaos in vivid terms. The elephants, protected by screens of light infantry, moved into the gaps in the Roman line. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Roman horses, already nervous from the strange sounds and smells of the battle, panicked completely. The Roman cavalry, which was supposed to be protecting the flanks, broke and fled. This left the Roman infantry exposed on both sides. But worse than the tactical situation was the psychological impact. The Romans had never seen anything like this. Their training, their discipline, their entire military culture was built on the idea that if you held your position, if you maintained formation, you would prevail. But how do you maintain formation against an enemy that can strike from a distance? How do you hold your position when an 8-foot-tall beast is bearing down on you and your officers are screaming contradictory orders and half your line is already breaking? Pyrrhus's phalanx, reinforced and reorganized, pushed forward again. The Romans, caught between the elephants, the horse archers, and the advancing phalanx, began to fall back. The retreat wasn't panicked, not yet. Roman discipline held, barely. But it was a retreat nonetheless, and once it started, it accelerated. By the end of the day, the Romans had lost somewhere between 7,000 and 15,000 men, depending on which ancient source you trust. Pyrrhus had won a clear tactical victory. The Romans withdrew to their fortified camp, their confidence shattered, their assumptions about warfare fundamentally challenged. But here's where the story takes its famous turn. Pyrrhus's army had also suffered terribly. His casualty figures were nearly as bad as Rome's. Many of his best officers were dead. His phalanx had been mauled. And when one of his friends congratulated him on the victory, Pyrrhus reportedly replied with the words that would echo through history, "One more such victory and we are lost." The Pyrrhic victory. A win so costly that it might as well be a defeat. The lessons written in blood. In the immediate aftermath of Heraclea, both sides tried to understand what had just happened. For Rome, the shock was profound. They had lost, decisively, for the first time in a generation. Their military system, which had seemed invincible, had been exposed as vulnerable to tactics they'd never encountered. The elephants, the mobile cavalry, the combined arms approach, all of it was new, all of it was effective, and all of it suggested that there was a larger world of military sophistication that Rome had been sheltered from by the geography of Italy. But here's what's remarkable: Rome didn't despair. Instead, they did what Rome did best: they adapted. The Romans sent embassies to Pyrrhus, ostensibly to negotiate the return of prisoners, but really to study his army up close. They questioned captured soldiers about tactics and training. They began to think about how to counter elephants, how to protect their flanks against cavalry harassment, how to maintain formation against a more mobile enemy. This wasn't panic. This was systematic analysis. Pyrrhus, meanwhile, faced a different problem. He had won the battle but not the war. The Romans had retreated, but they hadn't sued for peace. They hadn't acknowledged defeat. They were already raising new legions, already preparing to fight again. And Pyrrhus, looking at his casualty lists, understood something disturbing. Rome could afford to lose battles like Heraclea. They had the population, the resources, the organizational capacity to absorb defeats and come back stronger. He didn't. This is the strategic reality that often gets overlooked when people talk about this battle. Tactically, Pyrrhus had demonstrated the superiority of combined arms Hellenistic warfare over the more limited Roman system. But strategically, Rome had advantages that tactics couldn't overcome: a deep reserve of manpower, a confederation of Italian allies who remained loyal, and a political system that didn't need to win every battle, it just needed to outlast its enemies. The two armies would fight again, at Asculum in 279 BCE. That battle was even bloodier, even more inconclusive. Pyrrhus won again, barely, and the casualties were so severe that the phrase Pyrrhic victory became even more firmly associated with his name. The war dragged on. Pyrrhus went to Sicily, got distracted by opportunities there, came back to Italy, fought more battles, won some, lost some, and eventually, exhausted and running out of resources, withdrew back to Greece in 275 BCE. The conventional narrative treats this as a failure for Pyrrhus, and in political terms, it was. He never built his Western Empire. He never defeated Rome decisively enough to force them to terms. But in military terms, Pyrrhus had achieved something more significant. He had forced Rome to confront the limitations of its own military system, and in doing so, he had set in motion a transformation that would define the next century of Roman military development. The transformation. Here's what changed after Heraclea, and why it matters. First, Rome began to take the cavalry seriously. Before Pyrrhus, Roman cavalry was an afterthought, a prestige position for wealthy citizens who wanted to avoid the dangers of the infantry line. After Pyrrhus, Rome began to develop real cavalry doctrine. They couldn't match the horse archers, Italy didn't have the cavalry tradition of the steppes, but they could and did start building heavy cavalry capable of countering enemy horsemen. More importantly, they began to think about battles in terms of mobility and flanking, not just frontal assault. Second, Rome learned to counter elephants. It's a fascinating case study in military innovation. The first time you face elephants, they are terrifying and unstoppable. The second time, you've started to think about their vulnerabilities. The elephants were powerful, but they were also vulnerable to panic. Light infantry, armed with javelins and trained to target the mahouts and the elephant's sensitive areas, could disrupt an elephant charge. Loud noises, fire, even pigs, ancient sources claim that squealing pigs could spook war elephants, all became part of the Roman anti-elephant toolkit. By the time Hannibal brought elephants to Italy 60 years later, the Romans had become so proficient at countering them that the elephants were almost a liability. Third, and most importantly, Rome began to think in terms of combined arms. The rigid separation between infantry, cavalry, and light troops began to break down. Roman commanders started to organize their armies with more flexibility, to coordinate different types of units in support of each other. This wasn't a quick change, it took decades, but the seeds were planted at Heraclea. By the time Rome faced Hannibal in the Second Punic War, they had absorbed the lessons of Pyrrhus. They had learned to fight mobile enemies, to counter cavalry harassment, to maintain discipline in the face of unfamiliar tactics. And when they finally defeated Hannibal at Zama in 202 BC, they did so using many of the same principles Pyrrhus had employed against them: cavalry superiority on the flanks, combined arms coordination, and the flexibility to adapt during the battle. But the influence went beyond Rome. The clash between Roman and Hellenistic warfare at Heraclea established a pattern that would repeat throughout ancient history. Heavy infantry versus mobile cavalry. Western discipline versus Eastern fluidity. The tortoise versus the hawk. Neither approach was inherently superior, each had its advantages and vulnerabilities. The key was understanding both, and knowing how to adapt to the specific circumstances of each battle. This is what Pyrrhus understood, and what makes him such a fascinating figure. He wasn't just a great tactician, he was a great teacher, even if he was teaching by example to an enemy who would eventually surpass him. The Romans learned from their defeats at his hands, and those lessons helped shape the military system that would eventually conquer the Mediterranean world. The echo through history. Fast forward 1500 years. The plains of Anatolia, the endless steppes of Central Asia, the fields of medieval Europe. The same tactical problems keep appearing. How does heavy infantry deal with mobile cavalry? How do you force an enemy who won't stand and fight to commit to battle? How do you maintain formation discipline when you're being harassed from multiple directions? The Byzantines, fighting the Sassanid Persians and later the Arab invasions, rediscovered what Pyrrhus had known. You need combined arms, you need flexibility, you need cavalry that can both screen your infantry and pursue a broken enemy. The cataphracts, heavy cavalry that could charge home with decisive force, became a cornerstone of Byzantine military power, a direct evolution of the kind of combined arms thinking that Heraclea had exemplified. The Crusaders, marching into the Middle East with their heavily armored knights and disciplined infantry, encountered the same tactical challenges the Romans had faced. Turkish horse archers, operating on home ground, harassed the Crusader columns, refused decisive engagement, bled the Europeans through attrition. Some Crusader commanders learned to adapt, to integrate lighter cavalry to protect their flanks. Others, convinced of the superiority of the heavy cavalry charge, marched into disasters like the Battle of Hattin, where Saladin's forces surrounded and destroyed a Crusader army that couldn't maneuver effectively in the desert heat. And then came the Mongols. If Pyrrhus's army represented the sophisticated integration of different military traditions, the Mongol armies took that concept to its logical extreme. They were almost entirely cavalry-based, but they understood combined arms warfare better than anyone before them. They had heavy cavalry for shock charges, light cavalry for harassment and pursuit, horse archers for long-range striking power, and crucially, they had the discipline and training to coordinate these different elements in response to battlefield conditions. When the Mongols swept across Asia and into Europe in the 13th century, they were replaying the same tactical principles that had worked at Heraclea, but on a continental scale. The lesson kept appearing because the fundamental nature of warfare hadn't changed. Technology evolved, crossbows replaced javelins, plate armor replaced bronze, gunpowder eventually transformed everything, but the basic tactical problem remained: how do you combine mobility and firepower with staying power? How do you integrate different types of forces to create an army that can respond to different challenges? This is why military historians keep returning to battles like Heraclea. Not because the specific details of ancient warfare are directly applicable to modern combat, but because the principles are timeless. Flexibility beats rigidity. Combined arms beats single-system approaches. The army that can adapt during battle has a decisive advantage over the army that can only execute one kind of plan. The man behind the myth. Before we close, let's return to Pyrrhus himself, because his story doesn't end at Heraclea. After his Italian campaigns, Pyrrhus returned to Greece and continued his restless pursuit of glory. He fought in Macedonia, fought in Sparta, fought in the endless civil wars that consumed the Hellenistic world. In 272 BCE, during street fighting in the city of Argos, an old woman watching from a rooftop threw a roof tile that struck Pyrrhus in the head, stunning him. An enemy soldier finished him off. It was an absurd, unheroic death for one of the great military minds of the ancient world. No grand last stand, no dramatic final words, just a random piece of masonry and a quick sword thrust. The ancient sources treat it as almost cosmic irony. The man who had survived countless battles, who had fought some of the greatest commanders of his age, brought down by an angry grandmother and a piece of clay. But maybe there's something fitting about it too. Pyrrhus spent his life chasing glory, trying to be a second Alexander, seeking victories that would reshape the ancient world. And in the end, he failed at all of those things. He never built a lasting empire. He never achieved the immortal fame he craved. He died in a street brawl, far from home, fighting for a cause most people today can't even remember. Yet his legacy endures, not in the form he imagined, but in a more subtle way. The battles he fought, the tactics he employed, the lessons he taught, often unintentionally, to his enemies shaped military thinking for centuries. The Romans who learned from their defeats at his hands went on to build the greatest military machine the ancient world had ever seen. The principles of combined arms warfare that his army exemplified became foundational to how civilizations thought about combat. Pyrrhus wanted to be remembered as a conqueror. Instead, he's remembered as a teacher, and maybe that's the more lasting achievement. What we learn. So what does Heraclea teach us, 23 centuries later? The obvious lesson is about military tactics, the importance of combined arms, the value of flexibility, The danger of assuming your way of war is the only way that matters. These are lessons that remain relevant in any competitive field, not just military history. The organization that can adapt, that can integrate different approaches, that can learn from its failures tends to outlast the organization that rigidly sticks to what has worked before. But there's a deeper lesson too, one about how change happens in human institutions. Rome didn't transform its military overnight after Heraclea. They didn't abandon everything they knew and copy Pyrrhus's system wholesale. Instead, they kept what worked: the discipline, the organization, the strategic depth, and gradually incorporated new elements. They learned to counter elephants without using elephants themselves. They improved their cavalry without abandoning their focus on infantry. They evolved. This is how institutions actually change in the real world. Not through wholesale revolution, but through adaptation and synthesis. The Romans took the best of their own traditions and the best of what they learned from their enemies, and over time, that combination became something more powerful than either tradition alone. And finally, there's a lesson about how we remember history. We remember the Pyrrhic victory because the phrase entered our language. We remember the elephants because they are dramatic and unusual. But the real story is more complex and more interesting than the catchphrase suggests. It's not just about a victory that cost too much. It's about the moment when two military systems collided, when assumptions were challenged, and when both sides learned something that changed how they thought about war. The ancient world was full of battles. Most of them are forgotten, or remembered only by specialists. Heraclea endures because it represented something larger than itself, a moment of transformation, a clash of ideas, a turning point where the familiar became unfamiliar and both sides had to rethink everything they thought they knew. That's the kind of moment that changes history, even if the change takes decades to become visible, even if the people involved never fully understand what they've set in motion. The echoes continue. Today, we don't fight with elephants or horse archers. Modern warfare has evolved beyond anything the ancient world could have imagined. But the fundamental questions remain. How do you combine different capabilities, air power, armor, infantry, cyber warfare, into an effective whole? How do you maintain flexibility while preserving coordination? How do you learn from defeat without losing what made you strong in the first place? These are the same questions Pyrrhus and the Romans were grappling with on that battlefield in southern Italy. The specifics have changed. The principles haven't. And that's why we study these battles. Not for tactical tips we can apply directly, you're probably not going to face war elephants anytime soon. But for the deeper patterns, the timeless problems, the human responses to challenge and change that remain constant across the centuries. Heraclea was the battle that changed warfare because it forced people to think differently about what warfare could be. It shattered assumptions. It revealed vulnerabilities. It demonstrated that innovation and adaptation matter more than tradition and numbers. And it started a process of military evolution that would reshape the ancient world. The battle itself lasted one day. Its consequences echoed for centuries. That's the nature of truly transformative moments in history. They're often not recognized as such until long after they've passed, until we can look back and trace the lines of cause and effect, until we can see how that single day in 280 BC rippled outward through time, influencing battles not yet fought and commanders not yet born. Pyrrhus is dead, killed by a roof tile in a forgotten street fight. Rome fell, centuries after absorbing the lessons his army taught them. The war elephants are gone, the horse archers are gone, the phalanxes and legions are gone. But the ideas remain. The questions remain. And that's why, 23 centuries later, we're still talking about what happened when elephants met horse archers on a battlefield in ancient Italy. Because some battles aren't just about who wins and who loses. They're about the moment when everything changes, even if nobody realizes it at the time. They're about the instant when the old certainties crumble and something new begins to take shape. They're about the transformation that happens when different worlds collide and both emerge altered by the encounter. Heraclea was one of those battles. And its lessons are still worth learning. If stories like this fascinate you, the forgotten battles, the tactical innovations, the moments that quietly changed everything, then subscribe for more deep dives into military history. There are countless moments like Heraclea scattered through the past, battles and campaigns that shaped our world in ways most people never learn about. Let's explore them together. Because history isn't just dates and names and places. It's the story of how we got here, the chain of decisions and accidents and innovations that built the present. And sometimes, the most important moments are the ones you've never heard of. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and remember, the past is never as simple as it seems, and that's what makes it worth studying.